Okay, hello and welcome to this webinar. Many thanks to those who've joined us today. We're going to be talking about changes and developments in the SEDEX risk tool. Presenting today is me, Rebecca White. I'm the training manager here at SEDEX, and along with me will be or is Tom Sewell. He's product manager at SEDEX and he is the brains behind the risk assessment tool. In collaboration with others, but it's brilliant we've got him here today so he can co-present and also answer some of the questions that you may have. In terms of agenda, it's quite packed. We've got quite a lot to get through, but hopefully we'll make it in the hour. We're going to touch on first the risk assessment tool and the aims of the tool. And then we're going to talk about how we capture risk in the tool, what's new and what stays the same. Then we're going to be looking at some of the sort of new characteristics or functionalities of the tool in terms of how it can highlight vulnerable populations in your businesses and supply chains, how the tool uses audit data. And then we'll be going into some of the sort of methodology and background to the scoring. So how are we using data? How do we create some of the scores and what sources of information are we using? And as we have done before, we are going to take Q&A twice. So we'll have gone through some technical things in that first half and some background. If you have any questions, please, as they come up, please do send in your questions. And then we'll go into the second half that Tom will present, which is on going through really actually seeing a bit of the screenshots of the tool and hopefully going into the tool itself. And then finally talking about the transition and change from old to new tool, and then Q&A again. So in terms of how you ask questions, hopefully you'll be used to this by now if you've been to the previous webinars, but on the right of your screen is a question box. If you write your questions into that, we will then be collecting them and we'll seek to answer, we'll try and answer questions through the webinar. If we don't have time to answer all of them, we will take those away and we will follow up this webinar both with a recording of the webinar, a link to frequently asked questions on this topic, and we'll also write out any questions that we didn't get to answer during the webinar. But as I said, please use that box on the right to send in any questions and we'll do our best. Okay, this is something that I've not tried before, so hopefully this will work. We thought it would be interesting to know from those who are listening whether or not your company currently uses the SEDEX risk assessment tool. So I'm going to launch a poll, and if you could, hopefully that will work. If you can answer that, it's yes, we use it as it is, or yes, we use it along with other sources of information, or no. We just thought it would be good to know about the who our audience is, really. Great, thank you. The scores are coming in. So I don't think you can see the answers. I'm not sure whether you can see the answers actually, but what we've got is so far about 3/4 of you have voted, and we have 31% saying yes, they use it as it is, 31% saying yes, they use it along with other sources of information, and 38% saying no. So that's an interesting kind of basically roughly a third each. Brilliant. Thank you. That's really useful information for us. Okay, so now I'm going to close that poll. Thank you to all that voted. And now I think you should be back onto our screen. Fantastic. Okay, moving on. So a quick recap really of what we have been doing. So Tom and collaborating with Anthesis and actually Ergon Associates as well have been working hard over the last year or more to develop an industry-leading responsible sourcing risk assessment tool. And this is a completely new risk assessment tool to what we have in place now. And this was really driven by the refresh of the self-assessment questionnaire and a realization that this was really a great opportunity to build an integrated risk assessment tool that built on the advice we got from experts around good practice in risk assessment and that sought to meet the evolving needs of our members. As I just said, we built this in collaboration with Anthesis. Anthesis are a specialist global sustainability service and solutions provider, lots of S's, and they have really brought to the table risk specialists, technological know-how and statisticians, and worked with us to build this new tool. And the purpose really of the new tool is to allow or enable and support our members in identifying labour, human rights, governance and environmental risks across their businesses and supply chains. And that, linking to the webinar last week about how risk assessment is not an end in and of itself, is really linked to this aim really to highlight opportunities for due diligence activities, development programs, capability building initiatives, according to the relative risk as shown by the tool itself. And so in terms of users, we hope that this is a tool that will be equally applicable to large multinational enterprises who might have very advanced responsible sourcing programs, as well as the smaller businesses who might be seeking to meet legislative or customer requirements, and that it can really be used to different kind of depths. And also a new thing, because the existing risk assessment tool is not accessible to audit companies, is that we're now also looking to make some of the reports within the risk tool accessible to auditors who might find that a useful part of doing background research or preparation, understanding more about sites or businesses that they're going to audit. So moving on, how do we capture risk? This slide is about what's staying the same and what's changing. And I guess really what's changing is the tool itself. But I guess we just wanted to make the point on the left is that in terms of the overall format of how the tool works, that stays the same in that it takes country and sector risk, which we call inherent risk, and then it puts that together with risk assessed questions from the self-assessment questionnaire. And then from that, it creates an overall risk score for a site. And that can also be understood by pillar as well. So that kind of overall format is the same with the new tool. However, there are significant differences otherwise. Our new risk assessment tool has been built from scratch, and one of the big changes is that the risk scored self-assessment questions are going to focus on those that capture site characteristics. I'll talk about this further in the coming slides. It also gives much greater visibility of vulnerable populations, and I'll talk through what those populations are, and Tom will show you in the reports how that is shown and how you can explore that. Thirdly, we're not using Verisk Maplecroft data as the data source in the risk tool anymore, and we are now instead going to move towards using publicly available and licensed risk indicators for country and sectors. And that really brings with it some opportunities around greater visibility beneath pillar level, and I'll also talk a bit more about that into what we call topic-based indicators. So moving on in terms of that first change and what risk information we're taking from the self-assessment questionnaire, we're looking to reduce reliance that we currently have in the current risk tool, and we're going to move away from using self-assessed information on management processes and policies. And the reason behind that is that by risk assessing that kind of information, we recognise that there is the potential for incentivizing some suppliers to provide the positive answer, particularly if they feel like that's going to be followed up with less audits, fewer audits, or that that's the answer that a buying organisation wants to hear. And so we consider that there is considerable scope for inaccuracy in those answers, and also that self-reported information on management processes is not a strong indicator of actual practice necessarily. The chart on the right supports our thinking on that, in that it shows risk data from about 6,000 existing sites on our system. And as you can see on the left, the risk scores from the SAQ answers were predominantly very low risk, very predominantly, with a few medium risk scores there. And then if you look and also almost no high risk scored sites from the SAQ. And then if you look across to the inherent risk, you see something quite different at the country and sector level. And what happens potentially is that you bring those together into an overall risk score, and you get a sort of potential artificial deflation of overall risk scores by bringing those two things together. And so what we're doing instead in this version of the new risk assessment tool is an increased focus on hard data, on the characteristics of the site. And that might be about the workers who work at that site, the type of contracts they have, their wages. It could be about the presence of hazardous materials and the environmental practices that go on there. And what we're doing is then using information from those questions to develop a site characteristics risk score. However, it is really important that we did not want to lose visibility of those sites or businesses that are implementing policies, putting in place monitoring and feedback systems, what we might call a management system, and that includes training and improvement as well. So we do want to keep visibility of the efforts and potential improvement practices that people are putting in place. And so that is also captured through the SAQ, and we're then using that information to create a management controls score. And that will be presented in the tool, and that's what also then goes to suppliers in the supplier-facing report from the self-assessment questionnaire. But that management control score won't affect the site's business or site or business's overall risk score. So, moving on, another aspect of the new tool that we wanted to highlight, and that's quite different and new, is this the exposure and information it provides on vulnerable groups. And we've split those into sort of two forms of vulnerable group. There's the vulnerable populations, and there's vulnerable employment terms. And this really is in line with approaches recommended by the UN Guiding Principles. And it asks that businesses need to pay particular attention to those that may be at heightened risk of becoming vulnerable or marginalized, and with due regard to the different risks that may be faced by women and men. So, why is this important? Well, it's because we find that these groups are disproportionately exposed to workplace-based risks. So it can be a really useful form of information when you're thinking about what next steps you might take in terms of reducing risk in your supply chain and managing risk. So we're just going to talk a very little bit about the way that these groups are differently exposed to risk. Women are often trapped in low-skilled work in many parts of the world, and they're disproportionately exposed to the most vulnerable situations in a workplace. And migrants, I think we touched on this quite a lot last week about the nature of vulnerable groups and vulnerability. But migrants are often vulnerable to exploitation, discrimination, and trafficking because of the situation they find themselves in, lack of support networks, lack of language, access sometimes, and not understanding the rights that they have. And similarly, the nature of employment terms also leads to greater exposure to risk. So non-permanent employment it can be non-permanent employees may not receive the wages and benefits given to their permanent full-time colleagues. And the challenges in that group might be compounded by the fact that, say, many migrants or young people, women, are found in those jobs disproportionately. Off-site workers, that might be mobile workers, drivers, traveling workers, remote workers and home workers. And they're really they're differently vulnerable, but often also because we don't see them that much. They're kind of hidden from view. So those are also another vulnerable population. So a question that does often come up and came up when we were developing this tool is about how audit data will be used. And there was feedback from members in the process of developing the tool that our current risk assessment tool does not make good use of audit information on a site or a business, and that's useful information to have. And we agree with that. And we did consider whether we should actually integrate audit results into the overall risk score. But on reflection, we concluded that audits and risk scoring are really trying to do two different things. Risk scores and the risk tool really looks to capture the likelihood of potential poor outcomes that may happen in the future, whereas an audit is a way to capture actual poor practice in the present. And if you're wanting to understand risk, if you bundle up risk score and audit scores, you're kind of moving away from providing a risk score actually into providing something else that's a bit unclear and potentially confusing. So what we have done is to keep these two elements separate, but we do make them visible in the risk tool. So as you'll see, like the table on the right-hand side of the screen, when you are in the risk tool and looking at risk data, you will at the same time be able to see audit data as well that can help understand what has been found at that site or in that business in the recent past. Okay, so moving on to thinking about background really on how we use risk indicators in the tool and how those indicators were chosen and built. So I'm going to focus on inherent risk. So inherent risk comes from information about risks at the country level, and we've segmented that now out by topic because through the use of these publicly available risk data sets, it means we've been able to kind of give a bit more granularity to country level risk scores. So you can see on the right the table that shows what those topic categories are, and then it shows which pillar, which SMETA or SEDEX pillar those link into. So at the pillar level, when we give pillar scores, it's bringing together all the topic category scores and showing you a pillar level score. But if you're interested in, for example, why have I got a high risk for labour, You can actually then drill down to think, okay, actually that was really about gender and discrimination rather than being about freedom of association and child labour, for example. So, so what we have then is that those country scores are then also brought together on a scale of 0 to 6. I'm sorry, on the screen it says 1 to 6, it should say 0 to 6. And that's then brought together with scores on sector from 0 to 4. Just a point there that you can see, it says additional points are given for high risk goods. I'm going to go into that in a minute, but where a particular combination of country and ISIC code come together, there are additional booster sorts of risk points that can be added to that overall inherent risk score. In terms of the weighting, so 0 to 6 and 0 to 4 between country and sector, this is a bit of a change from the previous risk assessment tool, which gives equal weighting to those different sources of risk information. So I just talked you through how the inherent risk scores are made up in our new tool, and I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about where the information comes from that goes into those country and sector risk scores. So as I said, we're not using the Verisk Maplecroft data for scoring. In this tool, we have pulled information from well-respected, publicly available and international databases on indicators for risk. The sources are shown by some of the logos on the right, and we've given a few examples. You can see at the bottom, say on discrimination, about which source of information we've drawn from. So for discrimination, it's Freedom House database, the Freedom to Practice Beliefs. For child labour, we've drawn from the Global Child Forum and UNICEF's Children's Rights in the Workplace. And how have we come to decide, amongst all the many sources of information out there on risk indicators, how have we chosen the ones we have? Well, the process was to go through huge amounts of different sources and score them and understand them in terms of those 5 points I've listed at the top of the screen. So relevance, coverage of countries and regions, that they had good and roughly equivalent coverage of countries and regions, and the indicators were comparable. So in other words, that means that the numbers generated for each country must be generated in a roughly comparable way, that they come from reliable and good quality sources of information, and that they were updated frequently. So moving on, I'm just going to then talk a little bit more about the high risk sector and product. I mentioned at the beginning that along with the country score and the sector score to make up the inherent risk score, you could get these little booster points. It's only between 1 or 2 points. And that really comes from where a certain combination of country and high-level ISIC section come together, and it's linked to a high risk according to public sources of information. We then give that additional boost of 1 or 2 points. So an example here is the raising of or cattle ranching, or indeed soy production in a number of Latin American countries, or here Bolivia, are associated with a high risk of deforestation according to the Forest 500 database from the Global Canopy Project. So where those kind of combinations arise, then there's a little boost is also given to the risk score to increase it somewhat or slightly. I have gone through quite a lot of information in the last sort of 25 minutes or so. I hope you found that clear, and I'm just going to see whether there are any questions that have come in that time. If you do have any questions, do send them in, and we'll just pause briefly for a Q&A. And I'm going to hand over to Tom. There'll be a little pause while I do that.
Thanks. Pardon me. Thanks, Bex. We don't have many questions. We've got a couple coming in now. Okay, so Debbie, you asked if we could further explain the reason for moving away from Maplecroft. I don't know if we subsequently answered that question, but essentially, if you're familiar with the current tool, the scores are provided at what we call the pillar level. So you receive scores for labour, standards, health and safety, the environment, and business ethics. But what we found from well, I guess speaking to experts and feedback from our members is that in order to better kind of tailor your response to the challenges that might be found within a particular country, it would be more useful to really understand at a more kind of granular level what those risks are. So currently the labour score will be made up of different elements such as child labour or forced labour, wages, working hours, etc. And it's all amalgamated into an overall score, which makes it difficult to really understand what those specific risks are. So by using publicly available indicators, we can kind of really highlight more specifically what those particular risks are. And that's where we come to this idea of having those topic-based indicators. Hopefully that answers your question, but if not, do send another message. We've got lots of questions coming in now. Melinda, you asked how often the inherent risk scores are updated. So they'll be updated annually. So clearly there's a number of different indicators that go into the, well, on occasion there'll be multiple indicators going into one topic. Other times there'll be one indicator in that topic. Oh, sorry, I just saw a message that said I'm muted, but I'm not, am I? And those indicators will be updated throughout the year. And what we will do is then on an annual basis, take all of those updates and refresh the tool. So the scores will be updated every year. Alice, you asked if a recording of the webinar will be sent over. Bex is nodding and saying yes. I actually sent you a message back. Abigail, you asked if it's possible to see how we map the topic-based risk indicators. Yeah, that will all be provided within the methodology document. So you'll clearly be able to see, you know, what are the different indicators and the sources of those scores and what are they measuring against the individual topics. We just didn't have space to put that on a slide. Alice, you've asked, is there any training or seminars that are available for someone completely new to SEDEX overall? There is, I think Bex may be best to answer that, so she'll reply to you in the chat function. Melinda, you're asking, will we share the country and product inherent scores by country and sector? Yeah, so I think when we go through some of the reports, you might be able to see how the scores are coming out. But yeah, there'll be kind of full transparency of the scores that come out at the country and sector level. Robin, you asked how we've assigned the scores to A, B, C, etc., and how we've defined the different scores. I might have to pick that one up afterwards to look back at what A, B, and C referred to on that slide, if that's okay. Robin, you also asked how do we differentiate between agriculture and waste management? So I'm not sure if it was made clear, but the way the information about a site will be collected will be through the site profile in SEDEX Advanced, where a supplier will be asked to enter the activity that they carry out. And that will be from a list that's defined by the United Nations Statistical Department, the ISIC list, and within that there's 21 different sectors. So whatever activity the site has declared that they do as their kind of main economic activity, that will be allocated to the sector that that activity sits within, and that will determine which sector the site is risk assessed against. Emma, you asked about if you're an agricultural company based in the UK with your own farms in Italy and Spain, where you pack your own products, would you still be seen as high risk? I guess it's kind of difficult to commit to what risk score the particular site would receive, but essentially if you have individual farms in different countries, each of those farms would receive its own score. And if you have a pack house in the UK, again, that pack house would receive its own score. So it'd be the score would be related to the specific site rather than yourselves as an entity. It wouldn't be so much that because you have your own farms in different countries, you'd receive an overall score. Each individual, what we call site, would be risk scored individually. Melinda, you've asked if you'll be able to pre-screen new suppliers, which is probably a good segue into the next section of this presentation, I think, actually, as now I will talk you through some of the different reports that will be available, and hopefully that will answer your question. I think we have time for another Q&A at the end of this session. So if we weren't able to answer your question, I think we got through everything. But if you have any more questions, then feel free to drop them into the chat function as we go through this next section, and we'll answer them at the end. I'll just try and keep an eye on the time. Okay, so essentially, the risk assessment tool is a suite of 7 different reports that will be hosted within our SEDEX Analytics platform, which some of you who run reports on SEDEX already will be familiar with. So the reports can broadly be segmented into 2 different types of reports. The first 3 that you can see there on the screen are those reports, including the pre-screening tool, which was just asked about, which are not connected to specific sites that you might be linked to on the SEDEX platform, but instead will just draw on that inherent risk information about countries, sectors, and in some cases individual products to identify what the inherent risks are of particular countries or products, and that will be separated from any information that might be collected from your supply chain on SEDEX. And then the next set of reports will be those that draw on both the inherent information, the inherent risk information, and then amalgamate it with the information collected about specific sites. So looking at those kind of site characteristics information and the management controls information, and blending those 2 sets of data together. And you could probably further divide the second set of reports into those that are looking at a supply chain in an amalgamated way, so presenting analysis about a whole host of suppliers. And then the second version would be where you're looking at a specific single site and understanding what the risks for that site might be. So they're essentially the different reports, the styles of report. You can see the names of the different reports on there. And in some cases, these reports might have 1 or more sub-reports. So actually, well, we've got 7 reports on here. Some of them might have 3 or even 4 sub-reports that provide different information, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail about what that actually means. None of these reports are ready to launch, but what I have got are some screenshots of the different reports that I'll show you now, so that you can begin to visualize the look and feel of what they are looking like at the moment. So this pre-screening report is one of those reports, as I said, that is not connected to information of your suppliers and collected through the SEDEX platform. But what we have are 2 different types of pre-screening reports. So this one here allows you to select a particular country, and for that country you'll be able to see the risk scores by the different topics that we're collecting information on. And you'll be able to see as you kind of hover over the different clauses, what sources of information have been used to calculate that score. And what we'll also be doing is acknowledging the kind of the limitations of the source data that provides a score by pillar, but also overlaying this with what we're calling reported evidence. So articles and reports, you know, from NGOs and media and universities that really kind of highlights where particular issues in particular countries have occurred. So when you're looking at a country, if in this example I've selected Brazil, you'd be able to see by the different topics, you know, what are some articles and information and research about those issues in Brazil, so that you can dive a bit further into that and understand, are the issues happening in a particular region within the country? Are they, you know, are they occurring now? So any kind of new information that we come across, we'll be updating on a monthly basis. So any breaking information you'll be able to keep up to date with. And the second version of this report will be particularly useful for those of you who might be new to SEDEX and haven't yet actually asked your suppliers to register on the platform, or you're not too sure which suppliers you should prioritize. You'll be able to download an Excel template where you could input the key characteristics of a site, so the country, the sector, and the product that they produce. That could be up to any number of sites. You could have, you know, 1,000 different sites, and you would upload that into the tool, and it will show you the inherent risk scores for those sites. So really helping you to understand which suppliers you might want to prioritize for registering on the SEDEX platform and completing an SAQ, so that you can begin to understand more information about that particular site. Bex mentioned as well that with particular products that are known to have risks associated with them, we'll also be highlighting those risks within the tool. So the sources of information, as I think we touched on earlier, are the US Department of Labor's list of goods produced by forced or child labor, Global Canopies, Forest 500 list for countries and commodities associated with deforestation, and the OECD guidance on responsible supply chain minerals. So looking at conflict minerals, really. And there actually be 3 different versions of this report. So the version that you can see on the screen here is showing a particular site that might be supplying you from Bangladesh, and it's showing that in Bangladesh there may be a risk associated with the product that site is producing related to child labour and forced labour. And what it will do is compare Bangladesh in terms of their production of garments, and look at other key export countries of garments and highlight whether those countries have known risks as well. So the list of sources is not extensive, but hopefully it begins to just really kind of highlight where these known key risk issues are occurring. And again, you can see at the bottom there, this will be overlaid with that reported evidence about particular products. There will be another version of this report that you can link to from a specific site that will compare, well, it will look at the activity of that site and understand, help you to understand if there are risks associated with that particular product, but it will also take the information from the self-assessment questionnaire where the supplier declares which countries they source from and which products they source, to highlight whether any of those products might have these key risks associated with them as well, so that supplier would then be able to understand the risks potentially that could be within their supply chain. So now moving on to the reports that begin to blend the inherent risk data with the information connected to you on the SEDEX platform. And what you have here really is our reinterpretation of the, I guess, the kind of bread and butter report that really helps you to understand within your supply chain which suppliers are higher or lower risk. So what you'll have here on one axis is the inherent risk score, so looking at that country and sector information. And on the other axis, we'll look at the site characteristics risk score. So what you'll be able to then do is understand, okay, which suppliers might be in a country that has a country and a sector that has a high risk, but also the nature of the workers that they employ and the recruitment methods that they use would actually mean that that site is potentially more vulnerable to those risks and might need further attention to understand what it is that they're doing to manage those risks. And secondly, as you can see on the right-hand side of this report, it will also draw in information collected from your supply chain from audits to also highlight what are the typical issues coming up through audit. So that will be broken down into the category, the subcategory, and the individual issue title, so that you can see within the view that you're looking at whether particular suppliers might be, or through audits, you're finding particular issues being repeated. And as Bex mentioned, that information won't affect the overall risk score, but it's just another layer of information to help you understand what risks might be occurring within your supply chain. And that note at the bottom there just tells you that with all of the reports, although we've got this kind of visual view, you'll also be able to switch it into a table format. So a typical kind of Excel style table that allows you to download the data, and if you want to analyze it, you can analyze it in a further way, but also you'll be able to see, what are the individual scores by topic, and also what's the overall risk score for that particular site if we combine all of these factors together. Okay, now if you imagine that you had selected a specific site from that grid or matrix and you wanted to drill down further into understanding what are the specific risks at that site, this is where you'll be able to look at a single site view. So this will not specifically be the finished look and feel of the report, but what you can see here is that it will essentially locate that site onto a map and show you information about the demographics of the workforce. It will also show you the inherent risk scores and the individual topic risk scores for that site, and also look at the site characteristics information. What it will also do is then demonstrate the management control scores for that particular site. So taking the information about any improvement projects they're involved with, whether they're collecting data, the policies and the processes that they have in place to manage their risks. And you'll also be able to drill down to see the most recent audit results for that particular site, again to see whether any of the areas that have been highlighted as risk are actually coming out during audits as well. And as you can see there on the right hand side, you'll be able to benchmark that site, so see how its score compares to other similar sites, either within the same sector or the same country. And we also have some data sets that relate to very kind of local level issues, so subnational data sets that might show, for example, whether the site is located in an area of high water stress, or if there's an area that might be near a kind of protected area for land rights. And we're also trying to explore what other data sets we might be able to bring in there in terms of multi-dimensional poverty indexes and things like that, just working through what of those data sets are actually compatible with the reporting application that we're hosting this tool in. The other thing that we'll be doing and kind of hosting now within the risk assessment tool is we will be updating the report that currently exists within SEDEX Analytics called the Forced Labour Indicator Reports. So this report, if you're not familiar with it, it builds on our guidance on operational practice and indicators of forced labour. What we've done as part of the review of the tool is really look at the audit issue titles that are being highlighted as indicators or possible indicators of forced labour and their associated strengths, so possible, strong or definite. Reviewing that with the Mekong Club, who are really kind of experts on this field and have done lots of similar work related to modern slavery, particularly in Southeast Asia. And we'll be overlaying that information with some of the elements that we've developed specifically for the risk assessment tool. So layering it with the forced labour index that we've had specially built for the tool, and some of the other features as well, including those products that might be at risk of being produced with forced and child labour, as well as the new scores from the self-assessment questionnaire. And again, we'll be making use of the functionality that's available in the tool to kind of help you to visualize that risk in a more kind of intuitive way than the reports currently do, for those of you familiar with those reports. I think this is the final report that I had a screenshot for. So this report, what we're calling the risk analysis report, is really trying to make better use of the data that's available to you within the SEDEX platform to highlight where those vulnerable populations or workers might be. So you can see in the bottom left there the 4 different categories. We have women, migrant workers, those on vulnerable employment terms, and off-site workers. And this will kind of pull together that information to create scores for each of those categories and allow you to really try and understand, what are the key risks within my supply chain, and what are the key workers who might be more vulnerable. And I will try, in fact, to show you a live version of this report so that you can begin to see a bit better how the different reports work, and also how this report and some of the other reports connect and kind of drill down to provide more information about specific elements. So bear with me. Well, hopefully now. Oh no, it's logged me out. Let me try this again. We'll get there. As you can see, there's lots of different reports in development. Where's the one that I want to show you? It is this one. We've got lots of different versions on the go. So that's not how it will appear in the final version of the tool. It will be much cleaner and easier to access, and there will only be one version of each report. But what you can see here, hopefully, is the risk analysis report that I just showed you. And basically, with each of the reports, you'll clearly have the title of the report and the description of what the overall report is doing. Within the different kind of subsections of the report, you'll also have these tooltips, which if you click on them, they'll tell you more about what that individual section is doing and why it's doing it. What you'll have at the top is a series of filters. So currently the report is showing any high risk issues that may be present within my supply chain. But if I actually just wanted to look at one particular topic, the report updates and shows me there that it looks like Ethiopia is the country that has the highest risk of child labour within my supply chain, and it's only showing me any sites where I have, any countries where I have sites located. What you'll also be able to have on all of the reports is this advanced filter function. So clearly we're doing lots of analysis with information, but we're aware that many of our members don't necessarily keep the information within their supply chain on SEDEX up to date, and what they might do is allocate specific references to particular sites or suppliers. And so you'll be able to filter by some of these features that you'll be familiar with, such as customer site reference, customer supplier reference. And for those users with a subscription to SEDEX Analytics Plus, you'll also be able to upload some information about particular suppliers or sites that's unique to you. So that might be your level of spend with a particular supplier, the proximity to brand, or any other information that you want to be able to input into there. It could be an individual buyer's name or something like that. And you'll also be able to filter the reports by that information to change the data that's on display. What else? So here at the bottom, you can see, you've got different representations of those types of workers within your supply chain, and a couple of nifty features that I like. If you want to, change it to a bar chart rather than the pie chart, you can. Again, as I mentioned, I think there'll be various different tooltips throughout the tool that help you to really understand the context of the different issues and what's happening here. And if you wanted to then drill down to understand more about one of these particular issues, you've got these buttons here, which should hopefully then launch a kind of sub-report. Specifically, as I clicked on the women report, it's taking me to a report that then goes into more detail about where there might be women who are vulnerable within my supply chain. So what I can see here is a range of information. I won't, for the purposes of this session, go into it in too much detail, but essentially what you can see is which countries are have a high gender risk and how many sites you have located in that country, how many female workers are potentially well, how many female workers you have in that country, and various components like that. And if you want to drill down into a particular country to see where those sites are located, you can see here that you've got 2 sites in Egypt. So if I click on that, the maps are very interactive and it will show you where those 2 sites are located, and display some information. Still need to work through some of the UI of this, but yeah, you can see that you'll be able to see specific information about that site, and then further go down to actually look at the specific site view for that supplier. And with all the reports, you have these buttons that allow you, as I mentioned, to see the information in a table format. So that would be called the data sheet, which will then switch it to that table view. But we don't have any data in this report, so it's a bad example. But you could switch back to that dashboard there. So that's probably as much as I will show you for now on the reports. As I mentioned, they are kind of all a work in progress, so these won't be the finished versions, and when they are more kind of polished and ready to go, we'll have further sessions closer to the time that really explains what each of these reports really does, and of course they'll be backed up by various guidance documents and training videos. But what I will do now is hand back over to Bex. I hope you found that fairly useful, and Bex will just talk you through the next stage of the presentation.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. I hope you found that exciting and interesting. I can see there have been a few more questions coming in just before we do that, and one of the questions relates to timing. So just going to quickly just go through, you've seen this before if you saw the previous presentation on the self-assessment questionnaire. In terms of launch and timing on that, the launch is going to happen of the new risk assessment tool in March 2020. So the mechanics of that handover is that the existing risk tool and the existing self-assessment questionnaire will run until the self-assessment questionnaire switches over into the new version in February 2020, mid-February 2020. Once we have, at that point, the old SAQ will enter into a read-only mode, and all new sites or people who are starting to do the SAQ again will have to fill in that new SAQ. And then we will be launching the new risk assessment tool in March 2020. At that point, the old risk assessment tool will also go into read-only mode. However, we will keep the Verisk Maplecroft data that is used in the old risk assessment tool available for 12 months after launch of the new risk assessment tool. What this means is essentially you will be able to access old SAQ reports and old risk scores through the old risk tool for a year, but it just won't update with any new information going into that tool. So it's really during the year that we would be looking to see everyone encouraging suppliers to fill out the new SAQ and then starting to understand risk for sites and businesses with the new risk tool. And obviously, immediately from launch, things like the pre-screen reports and the high-risk product reports will be available straight away. So I hope that's clear. I'm going to go to questions, and we're going to really talk about what support and training we're going to be giving around this in next week's webinar. I will just finish off with a bit more information about that after we've answered a few questions. But I think, I do remember seeing some actually while Tom was talking, so I'm just going to go with those. Melinda asked, do you know when the pre-screen information will be available for download? So Melinda, it's from March 2020 when the new tool is launched. But as I said, that will be available and to use and to get information from as soon as it's launched. Emma, you ask, how often will the publicly available and licensed indicators be updated in SEDEX? They will be updated annually. Robin asked, I think when you were showing the risk report related to the site, where you had the graph with lots of different dots on related to your sites, it said, are these non-compliances based on audits? Robin, the answer is yes. So they are based on past audits related to all of those sites. And then you can drill down on each site to understand what's exactly happening at each site within that. So as I said before, although that audit information doesn't go into the risk score, is not part of it, you can nevertheless see it next to the risk score on the screen. Emma, I think I answered your question. You said, when will the new risk analysis report be available? That should be answered by now. Okay, Mike asks a question. Can you run a report to tell the risk by category in countries you don't have a supply chain in, with a view to creating a lower risk supply chain? This is a great question. This is available through the pre-screening tool. I wonder whether I might hand over to Tom to add a little bit, because I think that also might link to sometimes product comparisons as well, but I'm not sure. No, okay. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Tom to answer the rest of the questions coming in. Many thanks for sending them in. And we will be providing a frequently asked questions document after this as well. And all of the questions that you send in are really helpful for us to understand what information you need in run up to launch. Okay, here's Tom.
Right, we've got less than 60 seconds left, so I'll whiz through that. But yeah, Mike, exactly. The pre-screening report will allow you to input a particular sector or country and see what the risk scores for that country would be. I forgot to mention it actually, but there is a nice feature within that report as well, where you can select another country and compare the two countries together. So if you're looking to, you have a choice of two countries that you're looking to source from, and everything else is equal, you could actually look at the, compare the different risk scores across the different topics to understand which country might be lower risk. And then Crawford, you asked if it's possible to drill down to areas of a country to assess the inherent risk scores at a county or city level. The main scores that are provided are at a country level, although we kind of went into this project really hoping that it might be possible to have that really kind of localized level of risk. What we found was that in order to allow comparability of countries, we needed to use data sources that had a global coverage, and it's really, really difficult to find reliable data sets that have that kind of individual county or city level information at a global spread. They just don't really exist. So in order to do that, you'd still need to commission reports from risk experts like Ergon, who do the Ergon I was going to say Maplecroft, who do the kind of in-country risk analysis reports. What we do have are some specific subnational level data sets that relate to water stress, etc. But they won't affect the risk score, but they do help you to understand what the risk might be at that localized level. But unfortunately, there's just a lack of availability of those kind of robust data sets that cover the regions that we need the tool to cover. So that was a very quick answer. I know we've just run a minute over, so we should probably wrap this session up. I will hand over to Bex to do that.
Okay, many thanks indeed to everyone who joined us. As I said, next week we'll be doing a set of webinars which is much more trying to get your input and reflections on what you've heard in this series of webinars, but really to also try and give us your ideas on what kind of support you think you need, what questions remain unanswered, in order to make for a smooth transition between old and new SAQ and risk assessment tools. So do join us next week. Many thanks for all your questions and many thanks for coming today. Thank you. Bye-bye.